Candlelight trembled across 200 faces turned toward a single doorway, and Cecilia Hartley stood in it, wearing a gown 2 seasons out of fashion, gloves darned at the fingertips, while the Duke of Rothmere crossed the ballroom floor as though the crowd between them did not exist. Their hostess's fan snapped shut in warning. "A poor relation, not worth the courtesy of a name," she told him, loud enough for half the room to hear, and a ripple of soft, cruel laughter followed. The line of the Duke's jaw stayed hard while the rest of the room softened with amusement. He asked for the girl's name anyway. Then, when no one answered him, he asked again, slower, and the music simply stopped. No one in that ballroom had ever heard the Duke of Rothmere repeat himself. He was a man who asked once, was refused nothing, and never troubled himself to ask twice. Yet there he stood, gray eyes fixed on a woman nobody had bothered to name, waiting. Her aunt's gloved hand closed hard around Cecilia's wrist, a warning disguised as affection. Cecilia felt 300 candles and every eye in London settle on her worn hem, her chapped knuckles, her borrowed shoes, and understood with a cold and sinking certainty that whatever happened next could not be undone. Months later, in a hall hung with portraits she had once been forbidden to look at, Cecilia would stand beside that same unyielding man while a child gripped her skirts and called her, without hesitation, family. She would remember the ballroom then only as the first small cruelty in a chain of them, the moment before everything changed, before a locked door, a dead sister's portrait, and a debt on a crumbling cottage taught her that the coldest man in England was guarding a wound far older than her own humiliation. She was Cecilia Hartley, 20 years old, the poor relation kept in her aunt's house on the charity that was mentioned at every meal. The girl who mended gowns she was never permitted to wear to a ball. She had learned, long before that night, to make herself small enough not to be struck. She had not learned until the Duke of Rothmere asked her name twice in front of everyone who despised her that being seen could be its own kind of danger and its own kind of rescue. War. Lady Featherstone's townhouse in Grosvenor Square blazed with 300 candles that night, and Cecilia Hartley counted every one of them from her post against the eastern wall, where the chaperones sat with the spinsters and the girls no one had yet asked to dance. Her cousin Araminta swept past in blush silk without a glance, and Louisa followed in deeper, Rose both trailing the scent of orange water and the particular confidence of daughters whose dowries were spoken of at length in every drawing room in Mayfair. Cecilia's own gown had been Louisa's the season before last, taken in at the waist and let down at the hem by her own hand, the stitches hidden as well as 3 late nights allowed. Lady Beaumont had reminded her twice in the carriage that she attended only as chaperone to her cousins, that she was not, under any circumstance, to give any gentleman cause to believe she required introducing. It was a kindness disguised as instruction, the way most of her aunt's cruelties were. Across the crowded floor, footmen in Featherstone livery threaded between dancers with trays of ratafia, and somewhere, a string quartet worked through its 3rd quadrille of the evening, and Cecilia had grown skilled, over 3 long seasons of standing exactly where she now stood, at making herself the kind of furniture a room forgot to notice. She watched instead of danced. She had learned the names of every eligible man in London that way, watched them bow over gloved hands that were not hers, watched Araminta's dance card fill before the 2nd set. She did not watch for the Duke of Rothmere, because no one watched for the Duke of Rothmere. He simply arrived the way weather arrived, and a room adjusted itself around him without quite deciding to. He was tall in the manner that made other men stand straighter without meaning to, dressed in unrelieved black but for a signet ring that caught the candlelight when he moved, and he moved very little. He did not seek out Lady Featherstone's daughters. He did not seek out anyone. He stood near the tall windows with the rain starting behind the glass, and for reasons Cecilia could not have named, his gaze crossed the room once, twice, and came to rest, quite plainly, on her. She looked down at her darned gloves. When she looked up again, he had not looked away. He crossed to Lady Featherstone directly, and the nearest dancers slowed to watch him do it, because the Duke of Rothmere did not cross rooms for anyone. "Who is the young woman in gray by the eastern wall?" he asked, and his voice was quiet enough that Cecilia should not have heard it from where she stood, and yet she did, the way a held breath is heard in an empty church. Lady Featherstone followed his gaze, found Cecilia, and her mouth curved into the particular smile she wore for guests who had asked an unfortunate question. "Oh, that is only Miss Hartley, Lady Beaumont's niece," she said, already turning away, already reaching for the arm of a colonel's wife. "She isn't worth introducing, Your Grace. A poor relation, nothing more." She said it lightly, the way one might mention the weather, and three of the ladies nearest her laughed the soft, practiced laugh that women use to agree with cruelty without quite committing to it. Cecilia felt the words land somewhere beneath her ribs and stayed very still, because stillness was the only defense she had ever been permitted. The Duke did not laugh. He did not move on to safer company, the way any sensible man would have. He said her name back slowly, as though testing whether Lady Featherstone had actually spoken it. "Miss Hartley," he said. And then, when Lady Featherstone only blinked at him, uncertain now, he asked again, and this time, every conversation within 20 feet of him had already died. "What is her name?" Not a question this time, a demand dressed as courtesy. The quartet faltered on the turn of a phrase and did not quite recover it. Cecilia felt every eye in the ballroom find her at once, felt Lady Beaumont's fingers close around her wrist like a manacle, felt Araminta's dance card slip, forgotten, from her cousin's other hand. She did not know what expression was on her own face. She knew only that the coldest man in England, a man who did not trouble himself to ask anything twice, had asked for her name in front of everyone who had spent 3 seasons pretending she had none. Lady Featherstone recovered first, laughing too brightly, steering him toward her daughters with a hand at his elbow that he did not quite permit to land. He did not look at the daughters. He looked once more, briefly at Cecilia, and inclined his head half an inch, a gesture so small that half the room would later argue it had never happened at all. Cecilia curtsied because her body remembered how, before her mind caught up. By the time she rose, he had already turned away, and the music had already resumed, and nothing at all had changed, except that everything had. The carriage ride home was silent in the particular way Lady Beaumont's silences always were, thick with everything she intended to say once the front door had closed behind them. It closed. She said it all. Cecilia stood in the front hall, still wearing her gloves, still smelling of candle smoke and orange water borrowed from a room she had not truly belonged in, and listened to her aunt explain, at considerable length, the many ways in which she had humiliated the family that housed her. Araminta wept that her dance card had been ruined by the spectacle. Louisa observed, with the particular satisfaction of a younger sister who has never once been asked her name twice by anyone, that Cecilia had clearly done something to attract his notice, as though attention itself were a kind of theft. "You did not ask him to speak to you," Lady Beaumont said finally, not a question, watching Cecilia's face for the lie she expected to find there and not finding it, which seemed to trouble her more. "No, Aunt," Cecilia said. It was the truth, and truth had rarely served her well in this house, but it was all she had to offer. What none of them said, though all of them knew it, was the deeper shape of the family's fear. Cecilia's father had died 4 years earlier, owing considerable sums against the small Hartley property in Kent, the cottage where her grandmother still lived out her failing years, and the debt had passed as debts do to whoever held the note and chose to collect it. Lady Beaumont had taken Cecilia in not from affection, but from obligation, and had made certain, in 1,000 small ways, that Cecilia understood the difference. A poor relation who drew the attention of a duke was not a triumph in that house. It was a liability, a complication. A girl suddenly visible in a household built entirely on keeping her invisible. Cecilia climbed the narrow stairs to the small room she shared with no one, because no one else wanted it, and unpinned her hair in the dark rather than waste a candle. She told herself the Duke of Rothermere's question meant nothing, that great men noticed small things sometimes and forgot them by morning, that she would not think of his voice saying her name again, slow and deliberate as though it mattered. She told herself this for a long while. She did not believe it by the time she finally slept, and she woke the next morning to a knock at the door that was not her aunt's and not a servant's either, but a stranger's, holding a sealed letter with a crest she did not recognize. The letter bore a seal Cecilia did not know, a stag beneath a coronet pressed into dark wax, and her hands were not entirely steady when she broke it. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Lady Beaumont, and the footman who delivered it made that plain before he would surrender it into any hands but hers. So Cecilia carried it downstairs, still sealed, and stood in the breakfast room, while her aunt read it twice through, without once looking up. When she finally did look up, her expression was not the fury Cecilia had braced for. It was something colder, something calculating, the particular stillness of a woman doing careful sums. "It is from Rothermere's solicitor," Lady Beaumont said at last, folding the letter along its original creases, as though that might undo whatever it had already done. "He holds your grandmother's note. He has held it, apparently, these 2 years, purchased quietly from the original creditor. He does not intend to call it in." She said this as though it were a disappointment rather than a mercy, and perhaps in her arithmetic it was, because a called debt would have solved a different problem entirely, would have removed Cecilia from the household through disgrace rather than through this stranger. More troubling arrangement that the letter went on to describe. The Duke of Rothermere required a companion for his young ward, a girl of 6 kept at his country estate away from town, and had written, through his solicitor, to inquire whether Miss Hartley might be spared for such a position, given the family connection through the note, and given, the letter said this with careful blandness, her evident suitability. Cecilia understood, standing in that breakfast room, with toast going cold, and her cousins watching her over their teacups with new and unfamiliar interest, that she was being offered 2 things at once, though only one of them had been written down. The written offer was a position, respectable enough, paid enough, that no one could call it charity. The unwritten offer was an answer to a question she had not known she was asking since the moment his voice had said her name twice across a crowded ballroom floor. Lady Beaumont did not ask what Cecilia wished. She rarely had. She simply said that a girl in Cecilia's position did not refuse a duke's household, whatever the reason behind the invitation, and that arrangements would be made within the week. Cecilia went back upstairs and sat with the unopened trunk at the foot of her narrow bed for a long while before she began, finally, to pack, wondering what kind of man summoned a stranger by name across a crowded room and then hid the rest of himself behind a solicitor's careful phrases. The journey to Rothermere Hall took the better part of 2 days, and Cecilia spent most of it watching the Kent countryside give way to Sussex Downs through a carriage window, fogged with her own breath. A single trunk lashed behind her, containing everything she owned that mattered enough to keep. Lady Beaumont had not come to see her off. Araminta had, briefly, mostly to ask whether Cecilia thought she might, from her new position, secure an invitation to Rothermere Hall for the family come autumn, as though Cecilia's exile were merely an advance scouting expedition on the family's behalf. Louisa had said nothing at all, which from Louisa was nearly an apology. The rain that had begun the night of the Featherstone ball had never quite stopped, and it found Cecilia again on the second afternoon, drumming against the carriage roof as the horses slowed for a final long climb. And when she finally leaned to the window to see what waited at the top of it, she found gates taller than any she had known. Wrought iron worked into a pattern of stags that matched the seal she had broken open in her aunt's breakfast room, standing open as though someone had known precisely when to expect her. She had turned the solicitor's letter over so many times in the days since that she had memorized its careful, evasive phrasing without meaning to. A companion was required, the position was respectable. The arrangement was, the letter stressed twice, entirely proper, supervised by the housekeeper, no different in structure than any governess's post in any great house in England. It had explained everything and told her nothing, and Cecilia had climbed into the carriage 3 days ago, still unable to answer the only question that mattered to her, which was why a man who owned half of Kent and did not trouble himself to speak twice to anyone had asked, twice, for her name, and then arranged within a fortnight to have her brought to live under his roof. She was not fool enough to imagine romance in it. She had read enough novels smuggled from Araminta's shelf to know how such stories were meant to unfold, and she was equally certain that her own life did not run along novels' lines. And yet, the rain kept falling, and the gates kept passing overhead, stag after wrought iron stag, and something in her chest that she did not have a name for kept refusing to be reasoned into stillness. Rothmere Hall did not look like a house that welcomed anyone. It rose gray and vast against a sky the same color as its stone. 3 stories of tall windows that gave back no light because the rain had swallowed the sun entirely by the time the carriage finally drew to a halt beneath the portico, and Cecilia stood a moment on the wet gravel, simply looking up at it, rain finding the back of her neck, before a footman came to see to her trunk. She was met not by the Duke, who was nowhere in evidence, but by a housekeeper of considerable age and considerably less warmth, a Mrs. Whitfield who looked Cecilia over from bonnet to boot hem, with an expression that reserved judgment and made clear it would not reserve it for long. "His Grace is not at home to callers," Mrs. Whitfield said, as though Cecilia had announced herself a caller rather than the household's new companion, and led her through a hall hung with portraits so old their subjects had gone the color of tea, past a closed door at the base of the west staircase that Mrs. Whitfield's gaze slid over and away from, with a speed that told Cecilia more than words would have. "The west wing is not in use," the housekeeper added, unprompted, in the tone of a woman reciting a rule she had recited many times before and expected to recite many times again. Cecilia did not ask why. She had learned in Lady Beaumont's house that questions were rarely welcomed and even more rarely answered honestly, and so she filed the closed door away with the seal on the letter and the 2 askings of her name. One more piece of a puzzle she did not yet have enough pieces to assemble. Her room, when she reached it, was plainer than she had expected and warmer than any she had slept in for 3 years, with its own small fire already lit against the evening chill. And Cecilia sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, listening to rain on glass and the distant sounds of a house she did not yet understand, before a soft sound at the door made her turn. A child stood in the gap, perhaps 6 years old, dark-haired, solemn-eyed in a way that children rarely were, watching Cecilia with the particular wariness of someone who had learned early that new people did not always stay. Neither of them spoke. The child did not come in. She only watched, and then, just as silently, she was gone, leaving the door standing open behind her, like a question no one in that house seemed willing to answer. Grace did not speak to Cecilia for the better part of a week, though she watched her constantly, from doorways and from behind the banister of the great staircase, and once, memorably, from beneath the schoolroom table where she had wedged herself entirely out of sight and stayed there through 2 hours of a lesson Cecilia had improvised largely for the benefit of an empty room. Cecilia did not chase her out. She had been a watch child herself once. In the brief years before her father's debts and death had made watching a luxury no one in her family could afford, and she remembered precisely how it felt to test whether an adult's kindness would survive being ignored. So, she left small things where Grace could find them without being seen to receive them. A pressed violet between the pages of a picture book, a corner of bread saved from breakfast, a folded paper bird set on the nursery windowsill, and said nothing about any of it, and waited. The staff, meanwhile, spoke around Grace rather than about her, in the particular sideways manner of servants long trained not to gossip where a superior might overhear. Though Cecilia was beneath enough notice that they occasionally forgot she counted as one. She gathered fragments over shared meals in the servants' hall, that Grace was his Grace's ward, and not, whatever her dark hair and solemn eyes might suggest to a stranger, a stray relation taken in from charity, that she had not left the estate grounds in the 2 years she had lived there, that Mrs. Whitfield had orders standing since before Cecilia's arrival, that no visitor was to be told the child's name, unless the Duke himself gave leave. A scullery maid, younger and looser-tongued than the rest, let slip once that there had been a scandal years back, something to do with his Grace's late sister, and a man their father had never approved, before an older housemaid silenced her with a look sharp enough to cut. Cecilia turned the fragments over at night, the way she had once turned over the solicitor's letter, fitting them against the sealed nursery door beneath the west stairs, and the shrouded portrait whose edge she had once caught sight of through a torn corner of its dust sheet. A young woman's painted face, dark-haired, solemn-eyed, unmistakably the shape of Grace's own features grown to adulthood and grief. She did not ask Mrs. Whitfield to confirm it. She had learned by now that the household silences were load-bearing, and that pulling at one carelessly might bring down more than she intended. Instead, she kept leaving small things on windowsills, and on the 9th day, she found the paper bird moved 3 inches to the left, and understood that she had, at last, been noticed back. It was the Duke who broke the silence between them, not Grace, though it took him a fortnight to do it, and he did it the way Cecilia was coming to understand he did most things, obliquely, from a distance, without quite committing to the directness the situation seemed to call for. She found him in the long gallery one evening, standing before the shrouded portrait she had been careful never to be seen near, and she nearly withdrew before he spoke without turning. "You have been kind to her," he said. It was not a question, and Cecilia was learning that very little the Duke of Rothmere said was ever phrased as one. "She is easy to be kind to, Your Grace," Cecilia answered, which was true, though it was not the whole of what she felt. Standing in a cold gallery at dusk, with a man who had upended her life with 2 repeated words and had not, since her arrival, spoken more than a dozen sentences to her directly. He turned then, and in the failing light, his face was harder to read than it had been across the Featherstone ballroom, though something in it had shifted, some vigilance eased by half a degree. "Most people are not," he said. "Kind to her, I mean. Not because they dislike her, because they do not know what she is entitled to be to them, and uncertainty makes cowards of otherwise decent people." Cecilia thought of the scullery maid, silenced mid-sentence, of Mrs. Whitfield's standing orders, of the sheet over the portrait behind him that neither of them had acknowledged aloud. "I have not asked what she is entitled to be," she said carefully. "I have simply found her easy to love." Something crossed his face at the word love that Cecilia could not name and would spend several nights afterward failing to forget. A flinch quickly mastered, the reaction of a man unused to hearing the word spoken plainly in his own house. "That," he said finally, "is more than most manage." He did not explain the portrait. He did not explain the sealed West Wing, or the standing orders, or the fortune he had spent quietly settling a debt on a Kent cottage for a family that had never once thanked him properly. He only inclined his head, the same small gesture he had given her across a crowded ballroom, and left her alone in the gallery with a covered painting, and a question that had only multiplied since her arrival. What kind of man protected a child so fiercely from a world he clearly no longer trusted? And why, out of every overlooked woman in that world, had he chosen to notice her? The dinner party arrived with more warning than most things at Rothmere Hall did. A full week of Mrs. Whitfield directing maids through rooms that had not been opened since Cecilia's arrival, silver brought out and polished. A French cook engaged from the nearest town to supplement the household's usual fare. Cecilia learned, from the same servants' hall channels that had taught her everything else she knew about that house, that the guests were local gentry. The Duke rarely entertained and entertained now, apparently, only because postponing the obligation further would have drawn more notice than honoring it. She had not expected to be included. Companions were not, as a rule, seated at a Duke's table, and she had already resigned herself to a quiet evening in the nursery with Grace when Mrs. Whitfield appeared at her door that afternoon, with an expression that suggested she found the instruction as puzzling as Cecilia did. "His Grace requests you join the table this evening," the housekeeper said, in the tone of a woman repeating orders she privately disapproved of. He was specific on the point. Cecilia had one gown suitable for a dinner among gentry, the same one, altered again, that she had worn to Lady Featherstone's ball, and she stood before the small mirror in her room that evening, feeling the particular vertigo of a woman about to walk back into the exact kind of room that had humiliated her only weeks before, this time by explicit invitation of the very man whose two questions had set the humiliation in motion. The dining room, when she entered it, was already half full of guests she did not know. Local squires and their wives, a baronet's unmarried daughter, clearly positioned as a candidate for the Duke's long-withheld attention, and among them, seated with the particular ease of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered, Lord Pelham, whose eyes found Cecilia's altered gown before they found her face, and did not bother to disguise their assessment. She took the seat a footman indicated, near the foot of the table among the lesser guests, and told herself this was where she belonged, that the Duke's invitation had likely been an oversight of manners rather than intention, and had nearly convinced herself of it by the time the Duke himself entered, surveyed the seating with a single unhurried glance, and, without a word to anyone, crossed the room and moved the place card beside his own. Nobody at that table said anything at all. For the several seconds it took Cecilia to understand that the Duke had rearranged his own seating to place her beside him, but the silence that followed was of an entirely different character than the one Lady Featherstone had produced weeks before, with a single cruel sentence. This silence belonged to him. He held it the way he held everything, without visible effort, and by the time conversation resumed, it did so along lines he had clearly, wordlessly redrawn. Lord Pelham was not a man accustomed to redrawn lines. He waited until the second course to test them, remarking, with the particular smoothness of someone who believes himself charming, that he had not realized companions dined so well at Rothmere Hall these days, that in his own household, such arrangements were reserved for family. He smiled as he said it, the kind of smile that expected to be laughed along with. Cecilia felt her face go hot and kept her eyes on her plate, because she had spent 3 seasons learning that a woman in her position did not answer such remarks, that answering only prolonged the humiliation rather than ending it. The Duke did not smile. "Miss Hartley dines at my table," he said, in a voice that carried without rising, "because I have asked her to, Pelham. And I find I have very little patience left this evening for anyone who requires the reason explained to him twice." The word twice landed with a weight Cecilia felt in her chest, an echo of a ballroom weeks distant, and she understood, watching Lord Pelham's smile falter and die, that the Duke had chosen that word deliberately, had handed her back, in front of witnesses, the exact currency Lady Featherstone had stolen from her. The baronet's daughter looked between them with sudden, sharpening interest. Mrs. Whitfield, standing near the sideboard, allowed herself the ghost of an expression that might, on another face, have been satisfaction. Lord Pelham recovered enough to murmur an apology that convinced no one, and the dinner continued. But something in the room's arithmetic had shifted permanently, and Cecilia understood, walking upstairs long after the last carriage had departed, that word of this evening would travel, as such things always traveled, back to London, back to drawing rooms where her name had once meant nothing worth mentioning, and she could not decide, lying awake with rain again on the glass, whether that frightened her more than it steadied her. The weeks that followed the dinner party settled into a rhythm Cecilia had not expected to find at Rothmere Hall. Mornings with Grace in the schoolroom, afternoons that increasingly, without either of them quite arranging it, found her and the Duke crossing paths in the library or the long walk along the ha-ha at the edge of the formal gardens, where he had taken, since the dinner, to appearing at the same hour she brought Grace out for air. He spoke little, still, in the way of a man for whom speech had long been a rationed resource, but he had begun to ask her small questions and, more remarkably, to wait for the answers rather than moving past them, and Cecilia found herself telling him things she had not told anyone in years about her father, who had been kind and improvident in roughly equal measure, about the Kent cottage and the grandmother she had not seen since her arrival, and wrote to weekly regardless, about the particular loneliness of being raised to be ornamental in a household that had decided, the moment her father died, that she was not ornamental enough to be worth the expense. He listened the way she imagined confessors listened, without visible judgment, and once, when she described the night of the Featherstone ball with more bitterness than she had intended to let show, he had gone very still and said only, "I am sorry it cost you what it plainly did," which was not quite an apology for his own part in that evening, and was, Cecilia understood even as he said it, as close as he was likely to come to offering one. It was on one of these walks, a gray afternoon, with Grace running ahead along the gravel path, chasing a spaniel that belonged, apparently, to no one in particular, and everyone in the household equally, that Cecilia finally asked the question she had been circling for weeks. "Who is in the portrait in the long gallery?" she said, watching his face rather than the path ahead of them, and felt him go still in the specific way a man goes still when a wound long left alone is touched without warning. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost the ease it had gained over these recent weeks, gone formal again, careful, the voice of the man who had once said only 12 words in a fortnight. "That is not a conversation for the garden," he said, and quickened his pace toward Grace, leaving Cecilia standing on the gravel path with the distinct sense that she had, for the first time since her arrival, gotten close enough to something true to frighten him. She should have let it rest there. She told herself so for 2 full days, busying herself with Grace's lessons and the small, ordinary tasks of the household, and might have succeeded in letting it rest had she not, on the 3rd evening, found the sealed nursery door standing open at last. A housemaid inside airing the room with the particular briskness of someone completing a chore she had been assigned and disliked. Cecilia had not intended to go in. She told herself that afterward, too. Anne was not entirely certain she believed it, even as she stood in the doorway, and then, when the housemaid bobbed a curtsy and hurried past her down the corridor, stepped inside anyway. The room was a nursery, unmistakably, though one that had not been used in years, a rocking horse gone dusty in one corner, a child's writing desk with an inkwell long since dried, and above the cold hearth, its dust sheet finely pulled away, the very portrait whose torn corner she had once glimpsed by accident. A young woman looked out from the canvas, dark-haired, dark-eyed, painted in the first bloom of what must have been her early 20s, and the resemblance to Grace was so immediate and so total that Cecilia felt something in her chest turn over before she had consciously understood what she was looking at. Beneath the portrait, on a small table that had plainly been dusted more recently and more carefully than anything else in the room, sat a miniature in a plain gold frame, and beside it, a single letter, its wax seal long broken, its folds soft with handling. Cecilia did not touch the letter. She was still looking at the portrait, at the young woman who could only be the Duke's late sister, and could only, given the eyes and the dark hair and the particular set of the chin, be Grace's mother, when a step sounded behind her in the doorway, and she turned to find the Duke himself standing there, not angry, which she had braced for, but exposed in a way she had never seen him, his composure gone entirely, as though she had walked in on him rather than the other way around. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Now you have seen her," and Cecilia understood that whatever came next between them would depend entirely on what he chose to say after that. He told her the whole of it, standing in that cold nursery with the portrait watching them both. And though his voice never rose above the same measured register he used for everything, Cecilia heard, beneath the careful words, the effort it cost him to produce them at all. His sister Eleanor had been 19 when she fell in love, with a man their father considered beneath the family's notice, a solicitor's clerk with neither land nor title. And their father, a man Cecilia gathered had ruled Rothmere Hall with considerably less warmth than his son now did, had forbidden the match absolutely, and, when Eleanor defied him and married the man regardless, had disowned her entirely, struck her name from the family Bible, forbidden any mention of her within these walls. "I was 1 in 20, the Duke said, "and I did not fight him. I want you to understand that clearly before I tell you the rest, because I have spent every year since wishing I had." Eleanor had written to him for 3 years, letters he had not always answered. Out of cowardice he named plainly, and did not soften, and then the letters had stopped, and it was 2 years before he learned why. Her husband had died of a fever, and Eleanor, alone and ill herself after Grace's birth, had followed him within the year, leaving a 6-month-old daughter with no family willing to claim her. "My father wished her sent to a parish orphanage," he said, and something in his voice went flat and hard in a way Cecilia had not heard from him before. He said the child was proof of her mother's ruin and should not be permitted to embarrass what remained of the family name. I told him that if he sent her away, I would leave this house and never return to it, and I meant it, and for the first time in my life, he believed me. His father had died within the year, estranged from his only remaining child, in truth, if not in law. And the Duke had raised Grace since quietly at Rothmere Hall, protecting her from a society that would, he said, look at her exactly as Lady Featherstone had once looked at Cecilia, as a poor relation, a liability, a girl unfit even to be named aloud, except that in Grace's case, the unkindness would carry the added cruelty of calling her mother's love a ruin, rather than simply a misfortune of birth. "That is what the closed door protects," he said finally. "Not a scandal, a child who did nothing wrong and would be made to answer for it regardless. That is why I asked your name," he said, when Cecilia had been quiet long enough that he seemed to feel some explanation still owed. "At the Featherstone ball. You will have wondered, I expect, and I would rather tell you plainly than let you go on guessing." He looked at the portrait rather than at her while he said it, as though it were easier to speak to Eleanor's painted face than to Cecilia's living one. "You stood exactly the way she used to stand at gatherings she was not permitted to enjoy. After my father began cutting her out of invitations, he considered beneath dispensing to a daughter who had disgraced him, still, composed, as though stillness were armor rather than surrender. I recognized it before I recognized you, and once I had seen it, I found I could not simply look away and let Lady Featherstone finish the sentence she had begun. Cecilia felt something in her chest crack open at that, some careful wall of her own. She had not fully realized she was still maintaining because she had spent weeks assuming in her more guarded moments that his attention had been pity or curiosity or some duke's passing whim, soon to be withdrawn, and had never once considered that it might have been recognition, one wounded person seeing another and refusing, for reasons rooted deeper than manners, to let the wounding continue unchallenged. "I am not her," Cecilia said quietly, meaning it as reassurance and hearing, as soon as she had said it, how much larger a thing it actually was. "I know that," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, something like warmth reached all the way to his eyes. "I am grateful for it daily." They stood a moment longer in the cold nursery, closer than propriety strictly permitted, near enough that Cecilia could see the fine lines fatigue and years of vigilance had etched at the corners of his eyes, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her, rather more than the silence at Lady Featherstone's ball had, that she did not want to leave that room, or that man, or the solemn, watchful child sleeping 2 floors above them. He seemed to arrive at some similar precipice and step back from it deliberately. "I cannot court you properly," he said, and the warmth in his voice cooled into something more careful, more burdened. "Not without reopening every question about Grace's birth that I have spent 5 years keeping closed. Society forgives a duke a great deal. It does not forgive him being seen to choose a companion over a peer's daughter, while a fatherless niece of uncertain parentage lives quietly in his house. They would tear at both of you to get at her." Cecilia said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say, but she understood, walking back to her own room long after the candles in the nursery had been put out, that the closeness she had just gained had come bound, immediately, to a wall neither of them yet knew how to climb. The summons back to London arrived a month later, in the shape of a letter from Lady Beaumont that Cecilia recognized by its handwriting before she had broken the seal, imperious even on the outside of the envelope. Araminta was to be presented again this season, her aunt wrote, her prospects considerably improved by a rumor circulating through 3 separate drawing rooms that the Hartley family maintained a close connection to the Duke of Rothmere, a rumor Lady Beaumont had apparently done nothing whatsoever to correct and a great deal, Cecilia suspected, to encourage. Cecilia's presence was required, the letter continued, at a gathering hosted by Lady Featherstone at the season's close, ostensibly to support her cousins, and in practice, Cecilia understood immediately to be displayed as proof of a connection her aunt intended to leverage for Araminta's benefit, regardless of whether it existed in any form Cecilia recognized. She brought the letter to the Duke rather than answering it herself, uncertain whether that overstepped some boundary neither of them had clearly drawn, and found him in his study, going through estate accounts, with the particular grim patience of a man who found numbers considerably easier than feelings. He read it twice, the way he seemed to read everything of consequence, and when he looked up, his expression had gone carefully neutral, in the way she had learned, meant he was working hard to master something underneath. "You are not obligated to attend," he said. "Your position here does not require it." "No," Cecilia agreed. "But if I refuse, my aunt will say I was forbidden, and the rumor will grow rather than shrink, and Grace's name will be drawn into speculation, regardless of anything either of us does." She watched something settle behind his eyes, the recognition, she thought, that she had understood the shape of the danger as clearly as he had, that she was not a woman who needed the risks explained to her twice. "Then I will accompany you," he said, which was not quite the offer of courtship he had told her, a month ago in a cold nursery, that he could not yet make, but was, Cecilia understood, something he had chosen deliberately and at considerable risk to himself. "It will do exactly what you fear," she said quietly. "It will confirm the rumor rather than deny it." "Yes," he said, "I am aware." He did not explain further, and Cecilia did not ask him to, because she had learned, over these strange weeks at Rothmere Hall, that the Duke's decisions, once made, were rarely made carelessly, and that whatever calculation had led him to this one, he had already accepted its cost before he spoke it aloud. They traveled back to London 3 days before Lady Featherstone's gathering, and Cecilia spent the journey in a state of composure she did not entirely feel, watching the Sussex Downs give way to Kent, and then to the smoke-gray outskirts of the city with a knot in her chest that had not loosened since the letter arrived. Lady Beaumont received them both with an effusiveness so total and so unlike anything Cecilia had experienced in that house that it took her most of the first evening to recognize it for what it was. Not affection, but investment. The particular warmth a woman extends toward an asset she intends to profit from. Araminta, similarly transformed, sought Cecilia out for confidences she had never before wanted, asking pointed questions about the Duke's habits and preferences that Cecilia answered as vaguely as courtesy allowed. Only Louisa, watching the whole performance from the edges of it, caught Cecilia alone on the second evening and said, with unexpected gentleness, that she hoped whatever happened at Lady Featherstone's went better for Cecilia than the last such evening had, which was the closest thing to kindness Cecilia had received from that quarter in 3 years, and left her unaccountably close to tears. The Duke, staying at his own townhouse a short distance away, sent no word in the interval, and Cecilia told herself this was prudence rather than retreat, that a man managing so delicate a risk would naturally wish to arrive at the gathering rather than announce himself beforehand, and told herself this with rather less conviction each time she repeated it. On the morning of the gathering itself, a note arrived, brief and entirely without ornament, in handwriting she had come to recognize from estate correspondence he had occasionally let her read. It said only that he would call for her carriage himself that evening, that she was not to arrive with her aunt's party, and that whatever occurred once they reached Lady Featherstone's townhouse, she was to trust that he had not brought her back to London merely to watch her humiliated a second time. Cecilia read it 3 times over, and then folded it carefully into the same place she had once kept the solicitor's letter, and understood, dressing that evening in a gown that was, for the first time in years, entirely new and entirely her own, that whatever waited at Lady Featherstone's door tonight, she would not be facing it as the same woman who had once stood invisible against a ballroom wall. Lady Featherstone's townhouse looked exactly as it had months before, the same 300 candles, the same quartet working through the same repertoire of quadrilles, and Cecilia felt the whole of that first humiliating evening rise up around her the moment she crossed the threshold, though this time she crossed it on the Duke of Rothmere's arm rather than trailing behind her cousins toward the chaperone's wall. The room noticed. It noticed with the particular swiftness of a crowd that has been waiting months for exactly this development, conversations faltering and reassembling around them as they moved, and Cecilia felt Lady Beaumont's gaze find her from across the room, sharp with calculation rather than warmth, already Cecilia suspected, composing the version of this evening she intended to repeat in every drawing room in Mayfair by morning. Lady Featherstone herself intercepted them within minutes, all bright hostess smiles that did not reach eyes gone hard with the effort of recalculating a social equation she had clearly gotten wrong months before. "Your Grace," she said, "and Miss Hartley, what a very great pleasure." The word Hartley delivered now, with a warmth so at odds with her tone the last time she had spoken it, that Cecilia nearly laughed aloud from the sheer strangeness of it. The Duke inclined his head with perfect courtesy and said nothing at all about the change, though Cecilia felt his hand tighten fractionally where it rested over hers on his arm, a small and private acknowledgement that he had not forgotten either. They moved through the room together, and Cecilia watched, with something between disbelief and grim amusement, the particular alchemy by which the same women who had laughed at Lady Featherstone's cruelty months before now competed for a moment of her notice, complimenting a gown that was, in fact, considerably finer than anything she had worn to that house before, asking after her health with an interest they had never previously extended to whether she possessed any. She understood, moving through it, that none of this was truly for her. It was for what she now represented, proximity to a duke who had, by simply appearing at her side twice, rewritten the value assigned to her in every calculation this room knew how to make. It should have felt like victory. It felt instead like standing in the eye of a storm she knew had not yet finished gathering, because Lady Beaumont was still watching from across the room, still waiting, and Cecilia had learned enough of her aunt over 3 years to know that a woman that patient rarely wasted an entire evening without eventually making her move. Lady Beaumont made her move an hour later, in the particular way she had always preferred, sideways and smiling, choosing a moment when the Duke had been drawn briefly into conversation with an elderly earl, and Cecilia stood, for the first time that evening, without his arm to anchor her. "You have done rather well for yourself, niece," Lady Beaumont said, arriving at Cecilia's side with two of her particular allies in tow, her voice pitched for exactly the small radius of listeners it needed to reach. "Though I confess, I wonder what precisely you did to secure his attentions, given that we both know what you had to offer a man of his standing." The words landed with the same practiced cruelty as Lady Featherstone's had, months before, dressed in the same false lightness, and Cecilia felt the old instinct rise in her, the urge to go still, to absorb it, to let the moment pass unchallenged, because challenging it had never once, in 3 years, made anything better. She did not go still. "I offered him nothing, Aunt," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised her even as she heard it leave her mouth. "He asked my name, twice. I have simply been myself ever since, which is apparently a novelty to this room, though it was never a novelty to me." A ripple of interest moved through the small circle that had gathered near enough to hear, and Lady Beaumont's smile thinned, caught off guard by a resistance she had not encountered from this particular niece before. She opened her mouth to press further, and it was then that Lady Featherstone, drawn by the gathering interest the way she was always drawn to any conversation with an audience, arrived at Cecilia's other side with a smile sharpened by months of quiet resentment at having so badly misjudged a girl she had once dismissed in a single sentence. "Come now, Lady Beaumont," she said, in a voice calculated to carry rather further than a private word required. "Surely we are all wondering the same thing this season. A duke does not simply forget himself over a poor relation without some reason. One does hope, for Miss Hartley's sake, that His Grace's intentions are as respectable as they appear." The words hung in the air with their double edge fully bared, and across the room, Cecilia saw the Duke's head turn, his conversation with the Earl forgotten mid-sentence, his eyes finding her exactly as they had the first night they had ever met. And she understood that whatever answer this room received tonight, it would not be given quietly, and it would not, this time, be given by anyone but him. He crossed the ballroom the way he had crossed it once before, months earlier, moving through the crowd as if it were simply not there, and this time the room did not merely watch. It parted, because whatever doubt had lingered about the nature of his interest in Cecilia, Hartley dissolved entirely in the sight of a duke abandoning an earl mid-sentence to reach her side. "Lady Featherstone asks after my intentions," he said, arriving beside Cecilia and addressing the gathered circle with a voice that had lost none of its quiet and none of its ability to silence a room without raising itself at all. "I find I am happy to satisfy her curiosity, since she has been so persistent in expressing it." Lady Featherstone's composure flickered, some instinct warning her, too late, that she had walked further into this than she intended. "Your Grace, I know precisely what you meant," he said, and turned from her entirely, the dismissal more complete for how little effort it cost him. Before he faced Cecilia, and in front of Lady Beaumont, in front of Lady Featherstone, in front of every guest who had gathered close enough to hear, and several dozen who had simply stopped pretending not to listen, took her hand in both of his. "I asked your name twice at this house, months ago, because I could not stop looking at a woman who had been told, in front of a full ballroom, that she was not worth the trouble of an introduction," he said, and his voice for the first time since Cecilia had known him was not measured at all, was rough at the edges with something he had plainly been containing for longer than one evening. "I have spent every day since learning precisely how wrong that assessment was. I do not intend to spend another season allowing this room, or any room, to make that mistake again." Cecilia felt tears rise, unbidden, and did not fight them, because there was no version of stillness left that could serve her here, nothing left to protect against in a room that had just watched the coldest man in England unmake, in a single unguarded sentence, every cruel word ever spoken about her within these walls. Lady Beaumont's face had gone the particular pale of a woman recalculating an entire strategy in real time. Araminta and Louisa stood frozen at the edge of the circle, Araminta's expression somewhere between fury and dawning horror at what her mother's schemes had actually cost. Cecilia looked at none of them. She looked only at the Duke, at Alaric, whose name she had never once said aloud in all the months she had known him, and found, when she finally spoke it, that the whole watching room heard that too. The betrothal was announced within the month, quietly at first, and then, once the Duke of Rothermere had made plain he intended no secrecy about it, in every drawing room that had once found Cecilia Hartley beneath their notice. And Cecilia discovered, in the weeks that followed, that vindication tasted less like triumph than like a long-held breath finally released. Lady Featherstone hosted the wedding breakfast herself, with an eagerness that would have been comical had it not been so thoroughly self-serving, and Lady Beaumont attended in a gown considerably finer than any she had ever permitted Cecilia to wear, smiling with the particular brittleness of a woman who had spent 3 years underestimating the very niece she now claimed, to anyone who would listen, to have always believed capable of great things. Grace stood at the front of the small gathered crowd in a new dress of her own, no longer hidden away at Rothermere Hall, but presented at last, on Cecilia's insistence and with the Duke's quiet, grateful blessing, as exactly what she had always been, a beloved child with nothing whatsoever to answer for. Cecilia caught the Duke's eye across the room during the toasts and saw, in his face, none of the guarded stillness that had once made him a stranger even to himself. Only the particular warmth she had first glimpsed in a cold nursery beneath his sister's portrait, warmth that no longer had to hide behind closed doors or careful silences. The west wing at Rothermere Hall stood open now. Eleanor's portrait moved to the long gallery where it belonged, among the family who had finally claimed her daughter without shame, and Cecilia thought, watching Grace laugh at something Louisa had said, that perhaps this was what vindication truly meant, not the humbling of those who had wronged her, though she would not pretend that held no satisfaction, but the simple radical fact of being seen, fully and without apology, by the people who mattered, and finally, at long last, by herself. If a story like Cecilia's moved something in you tonight, the quiet ache of being overlooked and the fierce relief of finally being chosen, tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you longest, the second time he asked her name, or the moment he finally answered the room that had scorned her. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there are many more overlooked women and the guarded men who finally see them still waiting to be told.